doesn't get recorded. I left off last time with the theme of hope, and I didn't get to the greatest of the theological virtues, which is love, but I didn't finish with hope either, so I want to say a little bit about hope before getting to the virtue of love, which is connected to the word pity, which is connected to the sense of piety, by the way. But I'll say more about that in a second. I talked about hope as a terrific virtue that the characters that are arrayed behind Sauron lack. Although it's very interesting that when they are talking about their enemies, they tend to abuse them with the charge of things like being disloyal. So when Frodo is left behind, the dialogue says something to the respect of, oh, it's typical elven ethics, to leave one of their own behind. So in other words, they appeal to a sense of loyalty, friendship that's lacking in their opponents, but they still have to appeal to a positive, and they're judging by that means. But they themselves are not motivated by any such virtues themselves. They're motivated by fear, which is why when they are presented as a force in the book, at any rate, there's not much substantial there. It's almost they live by negation. They're there as an expression almost of the privation of the good. And nothing unites them except the way in which that evil which is behind them seems to deprive them of everything but fear. Fear drives them. It's also the chief weapon of the enemy. And that actually is what Gandalf says. The chief weapon of the enemy is fear, which is an interesting thing in the context of what's happened in the last couple of years under COVID legislation, because it clearly was the motivator for almost all actions. That and damn lies and statistics, right? Plus coupled with fear. And fear of what? Death. And that's a driver, and it's also the motivator for the men. That's why they want the Ring of Power. They want to evade the creatureliness that comes with being human, which is that they are mortal. It's not that of the elves. The elves want the ring for a different purpose, but men want it because they are mortal and they want to transcend their mortality. It lends life, the extension of life. Life at the expense of the goodness of life, but still a longer life, offers longevity. And the obverse side of that message for Tolkien is that death is a sort of a gift. It's not a curse per se. Now that seems to fly in the face of the Christian teaching that death is a consequence of sin. And I think on one level it does speak against that. But remember, this is not a direct analogy with the Christian faith. It's an observation about this particular world. And he's trying to address the contemporary situation where the greatest of all evils is seen as death. And Tolkien is saying, actually, there are worse evils than death. In fact, in death, there is a sort of release and the possibility of a fulfillment even in that. But again, remember, this is a pre-Christian story that is not meant to be seen as an allegory of the Christian faith. He's very explicit about that. So the judgment that he's bringing in death here not as a consequence of sin, and therefore his theology is defective. This is an unfair criticism. He's explicit about that, and he's making no Christian allegory at all. And so he's speaking to the particularities of the creation of men as opposed to the elves. And the elves they are immortal. They don't die. And they have a different threat from the ring. But the hope that comes to the death is that there will be a life that beyond the grave which continues in some way. and is better. So when Aragorn kneels before Gandalf to receive the crown, again, this is not in the substance of the work per se, it's in the appendix, there's a pause, and there's a sort of a revelation at that point, or even an epiphany. They see somebody who is more than an earthly ruler. He is a sort of a true lord, a true master. And they see something in him that of transcendence. And so the language is such. When Aragorn arose, all that beheld him, actually this is in the novel, it's the marriage that's not in it, but all that beheld him gazed in silence, for it seemed to them that he was revealed to them now for the first time. Tall as the sea kings of old, he stood above all that were near. Ancient of days he seemed, and yet in the flower of manhood. And wisdom sat upon his brow, and strength and healing were in his hands, and a light was about him. And then Faramir cried, behold the king. Faramir, who is one of the stewards, says, behold the king. And remember, the purpose of the stewards is to wait until the king is revealed, and the theme of stewardship is very important in the novel, or in the work. Gandalf is a steward. There are stewards of Gondor. There is a real king of Rohan and so forth, but many regard them as stewards. Stewards reflect on the dominion mandate mentioned in Genesis 1:26 to 28:29, where Adam and Eve are presented as kings and queens over creation, and yet are under the rule of God. So they're stewards, if you will, and they're to be stewards over the earth. And that theme there, and Gandalf says, I too am a steward. And what he means by that is that he is to rule in this life until he can pass on his duty to the rightful heir. And the heir is Gandalf, or is Aragorn rather. And so when he is crowned, there's a sense of not only the defeat of an evil power, but the extension and a development of the races of Middle-earth, so that it has improved in a sense. It's becoming clearer. In the crowning of the king, there's something hinting hopefully towards the future. And for Christians, obviously, it will be a reference to Christ. Right? And as we know, and I said somewhat perversely, Tolkien does not put in the main body of the work, but rather in the appendix, he then marries Arwen. But what's interesting about this, and here I'm reading outside the context of The Lord of the Rings, what happens then next? I don't know if you know. Do you know what happens to Aragorn? Have you read? Okay. So in the history of Middle-earth, Aragorn is succeeded by unworthy kings. You get no sense of that in the book, or in the movie rather. You get no sense of it. You get a sense of actually you get the city and the bride. You get the heavenly Jerusalem is what you get. That's the movie gives you the sense of the second coming, where the bride is there and the new Jerusalem up on the city on the hill, and the two together, and the bride, the city and the bride connected there, and a sense of fulfillment, and there is no more evil. So the second coming. That's the sense conveyed in the movie very strongly. In Tolkien's understanding, as I say, in the history of Middle-earth, unworthy kings follow Aragorn. Not what you would expect. Not really the happy ending. So the hope that is engendered by the reign of a true king is not enough. More is needed. Now, he doesn't put that in The Lord of the Rings, but it is there in the history of Middle-earth. And the lives of Aragorn and Arwen don't even end happily either. They become very sad. Aragorn actually he chooses to die of his own will. Not that he takes his own life. That would be a pagan act. But he decides to die rather than become senile and start to be a bad ruler. And he has a son, Eldarion, who is going to succeed to his throne. He's a bad king. He's a very poor king. which in some ways replicates the account of the kings in the time of the Old Testament. Right? You have a good king, and then it's followed by a very poor king, despite the fact that he had a good role model. So this says something about Christian education as well. Again, you can hold up the models of virtue and wisdom to your students. That doesn't mean they necessarily are going to live that way. There's no guarantee of success in education. It doesn't work that way. And what he does, though, and here's the language there, he lays himself down after the manner of the ancient kings of Numenor and died in the 102nd year of his reign and the 190th year of his life. And his last words to Arwen are these: "In sorrow we must go, but not in despair. Behold, we are not bound forever to the circles of the world, and beyond them is more than memory. Farewell." So again, with a note of hope, not by despair. On the other hand, the fulfillment of the hope is not in him. So again, very helpful when you read that on top of or in addition to The Lord of the Rings. Necessary, I think, in fact, to combat the idea that good has triumphed over evil and evil's gone, or that Aragorn somehow will not need a greater king after him to follow. It's made very clear in the history of Middle-earth then. And when he dies, his corpse is, I don't know how to describe it, beatified, effectively. And he becomes, a light surrounds him. And here's what it says: "Then a great beauty was revealed in him." Remember, he's dead. "So that all who came after there looked on him in wonder, for they saw that the grace of his youth and the valor of his manhood and the wisdom and majesty of his age were blended together. And long there he lay, an image of the splendor of the kings of men in glory, undimmed before the breaking of the world." And then Arwen chooses to follow him. She gives up her life, decides to die. Again, she doesn't kill herself, she just hopes for a fulfillment of her desires beyond the life that she's been given. And again, it's a hope towards a future that is not going to be fulfilled. Yes?
Do you think that's kind of like an image of, in terms of what, again, not to draw an allegory, but what Christ did on the cross, in the sense that he said he gave up his spirit?
Yes, in some ways, but then he will take up his own life and so forth. But yes, a little bit. Right, in a sense. I think even then, what that text is illustrating when he gives up his spirit is that he's the master even when he's on the cross. His death, he lays it down. It's not taken from him. Even at the end when he's crucified, he has to give it up. It's his choice at the very end. And the taking up, he's entirely more than hopeful because he knows that is going to be the outcome of this. But still, yes, yeah. But it's just showing his sovereignty even at the very end, that he sets aside his spirit at that point. Yes.
Whereas the portrait of this is more of one of hope.
It's more of hope than a sense of clear. It's hope because I'm going to make it happen in 3 days' time. Yes. Yes. Comment?
Just a question. I think me and like a lot of people have this idea embedded from the adaptations that
from the film.
From the films that Arwen, in choosing to marry Aragorn, gives up the immortality that she has as an elf.
Yes.
But is there any sense of that at all in Tolkien's texts? Or?
A little bit, yes. Yes, she's giving up the elf stone and so forth for healing, and she does choose to become immortal, yes, by staying in the world. Well, that's the consequence of not going to Valinor and leaving with the rest of them to the Undying Lands. She's chosen to stay here.
But is there a sense in which that if she was to stay in Middle-earth
and not chosen to follow Aragorn to the death there, she could have lived on. I think so.
Yeah. Okay.
I think so. I don't think it's sort of this.
That she would die of old age or anything.
Yeah, I don't think that so. In fact, so it's more of a willingness on her part and a hopefulness, though, not a despair, which is hard to imagine. Like, if it seems like a desperate act, but she has a hope that there's something that's after that, like he does. And it's clearly not in the immediate succession of them by their children, who are a disaster. It's a hope in the future. Again, it's not well fleshed out in any way in Tolkien, because again, he doesn't want to make it a Christian allegory too strongly, but there's a sense, but the theological virtue is there. That's my point here, of hope. And it's hope in something that is not even mentioned in the future, just mentioned as a sense that something will come. Anyway, so this idea of breaking the endless, what does Nietzsche call it? I can't remember the eternal recurrence. I don't know. I think it's the cycle of death and mortality, the unbreakable cycle. They seem to have a hope that that cycle can be broken, which is not, and it's not by them, because they give up their spirits. They lay down their lives in the sense that they, in the case of Aragorn, he doesn't want to become senile and a bad ruler. In her case, because she is hoping for a better future. But thereby they're giving themselves over to the sense that it's just another death. Their death is just another death. No, they seem to have a hope beyond that. The eternal recurrence is what Nietzsche calls it. Yeah. Which comes with the circle of life, to mix the Disney metaphor with Nietzsche. But there is a sense of a hope that goes beyond that. And I think that both of them are marked by that. And you can see that also in, even in the midst of Mordor, when Sam and Frodo are sort of crawling towards Mount Doom, and they see a star up above, and that gives them that same sense of hope. What is it? It says it's the beauty of it. This is the single star of Sam. It says it smote his heart, and he looked up out of the forsaken land, and hope returned to him. For like a shaft clear and cold, the thought pierced him that in the end the shadow was only a small and passing thing. There was light and high beauty forever beyond its reach. His song in the tower of Cirith Ungol had been defiance rather than hope. For then he was thinking of himself. Now, for a moment, his own fate and even his master's ceased to trouble him. He crawled back into the brambles and laid himself by Frodo's side, and putting away all fear, he cast himself into a deep and untroubled sleep. Why? Because he's now motivated by hope. Defiance is not the same as hope. Defiance is just bloody-mindedness, refusal to bend. It's the same thing, in a sense, that marks the sinner. It's the same thing that marks Sauron, an indomitable will. That's what he expressed before. Now he has something outside and beyond his strong will. So it's a virtue he does not possess. It's a hope, and it's come to him from outside and above, from the light of the star. And what's interesting is that he then falls into a sleep, which he's never allowed himself to do up to this point, because he's been so fearful that Gollum will come and murder them in their sleep. But now he falls into a deep sleep with a sense of comfort that they are being looked after. So he does not need to stay awake to guard his master, because they are being guarded, which I think is interesting. And also interesting is his sense that evil is in no way comparable to the good in strength. In fact, he calls it a passing thing, a small and passing thing. And again, what I said to you about the way in which evil is portrayed in The Lord of the Rings is, as they get closer to Mount Doom, it seems greater and more powerful and more weighty, and yet in the context of all of that, there's nonetheless a perspective outside of it which gives to Sam great comfort that actually, for all the appearance of strength of evil, it is a small and passing thing. Again, it's just those, and there are just little notes there of grace that punctuate the narrative, but they're really important moments. And they seem to have an effect on the characters that, if you're not reading carefully, you could easily overlook. So why is Sam able to sleep now when he couldn't before? It's because he has hope. He didn't have it before. He had a commitment to fulfill his task, a sort of a sense of duty, an obligation to, and a sense of, again, I'm not going to give up. Well, now there's better than that. So he has hope, and the hope will sustain him. So how about charity then? Any comments or questions about hope? I think that's amply all over the place. And the faith I already talked about. Charity or love. In 1 Corinthians 13, I read this passage a while ago. Hope and faith will abide, but the grace of these is love. They will pass away. And the reason why is because in the second coming, there will be no need for faith because we'll see Christ face to face. There will be no need for hope because it will be fulfilled. But love will abide because he in his nature is love. Right? The other two virtues are forerunners to the great virtue of all virtues, which is an expression of God's own character, his self-giving, unmerited agape love. And so that will not pass away. So it's the definition of who he is. When we speak of agape love or grace, caritas, however you want to present it, it is the essence of God that he is love. So that will abide. How does that then work out in this? But it's clear that it is the Christian virtue par excellence. And so Dante, in the Commedia, when he gets to the vision at the end, he now sees a dazzling, triune, and quite frankly, a mysterious presentation of God. It's not even clear what he sees at that point, because he's motivated by St. Bernard's mysticism more than anything else. And then he wakes up from it at the end. But the character of that love is mercy, or pity, if you will. And why mercy? Because we are frail, finite. It's not because we're sinners, per se. It's because we are frail. So this is Psalm 103. The Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. He will not always chide, nor will he keep his anger forever. He does not deal with us according to our sins, nor requite us according to our iniquities. For as the heavens are high above the earth, so great is his steadfast love toward those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far does he remove our transgressions from us. As a father pities his children, so the Lord pities those who fear him. For he knows our frame, he remembers that we are dust. Note the word pity there in the translation. He pities us. This is the expression of God's love towards us, is in pity, in forgiveness, in mercy. So in his own nature, it's love, it's grace, but when God's love collides with our sin, the way we experience it is in pity. It's not just love because we don't reciprocate. There's a lack of love on our part, and yet his love overcomes that. So it's pity on his part. As a father pities his children, as one greater who sees an end and the child doesn't. The analogy there, because he remembers how small we are, how pathetic, in a sense. This is very Christian, and it's very central to the whole plot design of The Lord of the Rings. Pity is at the whole center of the story. And I think Tolkien makes that clear. It's in all three parts of the Lord of the Rings. The Fellowship, the Two Towers, The Return of the King, pity is repeatedly mentioned. So it is the dominant narrative theme, is how pity motivates the whole company. Not friendship of the fellowship of the ring, and for all their virtues, of which they have an abundance, courage and wisdom, and temperance and fortitude and so forth. Yes, those are all true, but it's pity that moves them along. And pity is that's what this is. This is charity. This is love. Love is the motivation for it. And it comes outside of them. They experience pity themselves. And they show pity to their enemy. And it's pity that stayed Bilbo's hand, and it's also the very thing that has allowed Bilbo to be overcome the terrible effects of the ring. So he received the ring out of a show of pity, not grasping it, trying for power, but it just comes into his hands, and then when he uses it, he doesn't use it for his selfish purposes. And so for some reason, he shows pity. And it's not clear even why. I don't even think Bilbo knows why he pities him, but he does pity him. And because of that, there is a rippling effect that leads the whole narrative along. It then falls into Frodo's hands, and likewise, again, he shows pity. And because of that, he is protected from the evil, but also it allows Gollum to be the instrument by which evil will be destroyed, and will not destroy the good along with it. So this idea of mercy and forgiveness is the central virtue. It is not just any. So I mentioned this is the seventh of seven. It's not like the others. In the same way that Lewis in the Four Loves talks about agape love being unlike the other three, because it's unmerited. Remember, agape love, all the other three, familiar love, friendship love, romantic love, or erotic love, are dependent on the merit of the object. There's something good there in my family that I value, in my friends that I value, in my lover that I value. There's something that deserves this. This is unmerited. And that's what we're talking about here. It's an unmerited. So he is in sync with what Lewis is saying about a type of love, which Christians call charity or agape or in this case, pity. And Gandalf is the one that expresses it, and he expresses it in its first instance to Frodo's disgust and distress that Bilbo didn't kill this wicked creature Gollum when he had the chance. And I'll just repeat this. Why has Bilbo not given Gollum the justice he deserves? Because that's the question. Because if it's just a matter of justice, one of the temporal virtues, then he did an unjust thing by not killing him. Because Gollum would surely have killed him, and he deserved it. He wanted to do this. He intended to do it, in fact. And Gandalf gives the speech that is at the center of the whole epic, then, the whole narrative. What a pity that Bilbo did not stab that vile creature when he had a chance. Pity, this is Gandalf's reply, it was pity that stayed his hand. Pity and mercy, not to strike without need. And he has been well rewarded, Frodo. Be sure that Bilbo took so little hurt from the evil and escaped in the end because he began his ownership of the ring so, with pity. So note this, grace at the very beginning and therefore grace at the end. So it was an act outside of himself. It was an unmerited favor. He didn't even decide to do this, but because he did it, it would determine his own destiny and his ability to inure himself of the otherwise all encompassing destructive powers of the ring and its evil. And Frodo says, I'm sorry, but I am frightened, and I do not feel any pity for Gollum. You've not seen him, Gandalf broke in. No, and I don't want to, said Frodo. Now, at any rate, he is as bad as an orc, and just an enemy. He deserves death. Deserves it, says Gandalf. I dare say he does. Many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. can you give it to them? Then do not be too eager to deal out death in judgment, for even the very wise cannot see all ends. And he's speaking of himself here, by the way. I have not much hope that Gollum can be cured before he dies, but there is a chance of it, and he is bound up with the fate of the ring. My heart tells me that he has some part to play yet, for good or ill, before the end. And when that comes, the pity of Bilbo may rule the fate of many, yours not least. So that's the central speech in the whole of the story, right there. How the whole, and it began in what? In The Hobbit, which he hadn't even connected the Lord of the Rings story at that point, but it became a device that was far more powerful than he had realized. An apparent accident, and again, I have said repeatedly that accidents in Tolkien's account, or chance, or luck, or fate, are always overruled by something that seems to be greater than that. There's a sense of providence in these acts. But that last line, the pity of Bilbo may rule the fate of many, is repeated all over the Lord of the Rings. And it becomes true not only literally, because it's, as I say, the means by which the ring is ultimately destroyed. He kept him alive so that he could then destroy the ring unwittingly. And you were going to fail that, and there was an awareness of that outside, above all this. So there's a sense of, an ordering that goes outside of the intentions of the characters within the story. And again, points to providential love. But also in a spiritual sense. And it's certainly not pagan then. Gollum, he says, deserves mercy, even though he's a terrible creature. He says he deserves mercy. Hamlet says the same thing, by the way, in, is it Hamlet? It is Hamlet. Treat them better for not, if we received what, no, I'm going to totally botch the quote. If each one was judged in accordance with his deserts, which one of us would escape whipping? So it's not just measure for measure. There's something that you need to treat them better. You need to treat them with grace. It's an expression of an awareness there in Shakespeare as well. But he has committed the sin of Cain. Note the difference between Gollum's receipt of the ring. He kills his cousin. He murders him. Sin of Cain. Bilbo, not even related to the creature, shows mercy. So what's the effect of that going to be on him? And now, in a sense, there's deep religious teaching here. Motive matters. Your actions matter. They matter more than just for the person that's in front of you. They change the whole course of your entire life. By not killing Gollum, he lived for another 500 years. It allowed him to live, but the life that he lived then didn't make him happier. It made him even more wretched. He became more and more wretched. He was utterly fixated on regaining the ring. And his torment is nothing other than evil itself. The reward for evil with which he began the possession of the ring makes him worse and worse. He becomes more and more evil and more wretched. So the reward for the way in which he got the ring to begin with is to be tortured by it and tormented and become far worse. And because of this, he's a pitiable creature. In the same sense that you see an addict who has done this to him or herself, then in the end becomes pitiable. Yes?
Dr. Matthew, why is it pity and not compassion? Like, why does he use pity but not compassion? Is it because of like an authority, like the mercy aspect, but that's also compassion?
Well, compassion literally means to suffer with. And so a good question. I'm going to answer in a second here because it is related to piety. And piety is different than pathos and passion. So passion is just suffering, right? The passion of the Christ, passive voice, is to receive the consequences of an action. The active voice versus the passive voice. Christ suffers passively on the cross, in the sense that our sins are laid upon him, etc. And to feel compassion, that's the virtue of Rousseau and the Romantics. To feel your pain. There's more intended than that. It's not a psychological solidarity. It's a willingness to forego justice. Compassion doesn't even consider, it thinks that a sympathetic identification with the object is the means of uniting people on the opposite sides of things. It's just a feeling that. This is an action. Pity is an action here. It's not just I'm suffering along with you. It's an active force. Even though here it's getting rid of injustice, by refusing to take an action, or by showing pity rather, something very active is being done. It doesn't seem like it, because it's refusing to act. It's allowing the person to live, but you could do otherwise. They're in your mercy. So this is very much more of an active thing than a psychological thing. So there's a shift there. And the wizard Gandalf explains this a little bit further. So he says, if all die who deserve punishment, maybe none will live. Right, so there is a broader implication. So it's not just you need to feel sorry for him because there's this poor wretched creature. There's a broader, almost a theological and philosophical consideration that actually, if you think that he deserves to die, which he does, you need to consider that you also deserve to die. That's not compassion. Compassion is sort of seeing the justification for the creature being as it is. There's no justification going on here. There's no sympathy going on. It's simply, you deserve to die and I'm not going to kill you. But it's an awareness of something greater than that. And Gandalf adds, many perish who are worthy of life, and yet who can restore them? And the answer obviously is none. And so Frodo assesses Gollum there by a standard that is really outside of human considerations here. It's foregoing justice. It's the choice to do that, which lies within his power. You don't have to do what this person deserves. You can give them better than they deserve. And why? Gandalf suggests, because you are going to be given a mercy that you don't deserve. Perhaps. He just hints at it. So it's got nothing to do with merit. And the reason why is because there's something in him that may be in us as well. Now, Gandalf only hints at this, but I think it's clear. That's the reason. That's why it has its power. It's the thing that the reason, and we see that negatively because everyone on Middle-earth wants the ring. They feel it, and that's the sign that they are sinners. That's the sign. There's something there in what possessed Gollum that possesses them as well, and thereby merits judgment on them, because they ought not to. But they feel the desire to do that. And so they deserve death. And so he extols pity in that sense. Now, what do we mean by pity? Now, I said this, that it has a sense of piety. Let me come to this section. I think this is really rather helpful. The Latin word pietas, which is the chief word that's used to describe Aeneas in the Aeneid. It's pious Aeneas. He's called pious Aeneas. Pietas establishes a solidarity between the person who gives it and the person who receives it. It's a responsibility, a devotion, a duty, a kindness, a tenderness, a loyalty. It's not compassion. Compassion is, in a sense, you feel sorry for them. This is stronger than that. It's a it's a theological judgment that what you see so despicable in that person that deserves death, you recognize is there in you as well. There, but for the grace of God, go I. That's the sense there. You've heard Christians say that, right? So that person has done what a terrible thing, and the worst sinner, that could be me. And you hear Christians say that, and I'm not sure they always mean what they say there, but I think it's a correct sentiment. That sin, because when you indulge the sin and you persist in it, it leads down a path that is unimaginable to the person when they first start it themselves. But the awareness that you could do it is the awareness that you possess original sin. And the pity is a solidarity with that person. It's an act of fraternity, not just compassion. But it's a deep metaphysical awareness that you are equally under the judgment. You deserve the judgment that you're judging your brother, in this case Gollum, with. You can see his sin, but you can't see your own. Actually, piety or pity here is acknowledging it. Pity's not a virtue in pagan cultures, by the way. Justice is. If your enemy's before you, what they deserve is to die, and you give them that. You would not pity your enemies. The question or comment?
To that very point, I was just going to write that, or I wrote down that it's kind of like, again, when Christ says, he without sin cast the first stone.
Right.
And if you were to pick up the stone and cast it, it is not justice that you're enacting, because then you would need to...
It is justice, but you're going to get it.
You would get it as well.
Right. He who right. And who doesn't cast it? Well, none of them cast it. But why don't they cast it? It's a funny old thing. I don't think he necessarily means that everyone in the group of men who picked up the stones was an adulterer with that particular woman. I don't know. Maybe that is implied, and maybe they all were. It's not clear from the text. What is clear to the reader, who's almost more important than the audience in that narrative, is that there is a universality of the sin in us which we judge others by. And again, it's like the speck in your own eye and the log in somebody else's. You see that very clearly. You don't see it in yourself. Or you minimize your own sinfulness to the point where, and then you excuse it. There's not much there. Whereas in them, you judge by the worst motives and you see it in its expansiveness. Pity is showing solidarity with the person that you see as a sinner. When I say solidarity, you say, yeah, me too. I'm not saying you're guilty of that. I'm saying we're guilty of that. And so by showing you pity, I'm expecting to receive pity. So it's judging yourself. Yes?
Can you just again go over how our pity relates to God having pity for us? Because it's a different type of pity. In the sense of he's not recognizing his own sin.
Of course not. Oh, you're talking about Christ here? Or you? Well, God shows us pity for... Yes, it's not out of solidarity or compassion because he's a sinner like we are. It's because we have no one to take away our sin. And so he has pity on us, and he takes on our nature, and he bears our sins on his shoulders. So it's a different type of pity. It is a pity, but it's not one of solidarity in the sense of a fellow sinner showing compassion for another sinner, but rather of God, who realizes that mankind can't escape the consequences of their own sinful actions unless there's a Redeemer. And it can't be a Redeemer if the Redeemer himself is a sinner, because then the sin remains. He deserves to die. If Jesus committed any sin, when he was crucified, he would get what he deserves. Even though they're false charges, there'd be some sense, at least from the vantage point of God, that a man who had sin in him died on the cross. Well, of course he did. And nothing changes. But because he has no sin, his pity is effective in taking away our sin. Remember, he bears our sins. Our sins are placed on his shoulders. And the fact that he has no sin is imputed to us. So it's imputed righteousness, is my understanding there. Does that make any sense? Thanks for the question and the request for clarification. I think it is important there. So that's why I say it's more than compassion in the sense of sympathy, a feeling of solidarity, or in the case of Bilbo and of Frodo, it's an awareness that he is as bad. And in fact, it's made very clear in the narrative that he starts to, as he goes on, he feels more and more awareness of how hard it must be for Gollum, because he feels it himself. He feels more pity because he's more aware of his own depravity as he gets closer to Mount Doom. That's because he's being given over to the power of sin. And he can't resist it. He can't stop it. He can't go any further. He can't. And so he feels an awareness of how hard it must be for Gollum, in fact, how impossible it must be. And now he feels full compassion, and he knows that he needs it. And that's where the grace of God then breaks in, and evil destroys evil. Right? The evil thing, who is Gollum in the end, brings it down on itself. And again, the sense of a light breaking in and destroying evil outside the intentions or the capacities of Frodo is a demonstration of the power of pity. Make any sense? Let me give other illustrations, because it's very important. So in the Battle of Helm's Deep, at the end of that, Gandalf offers Saruman pity. And Saruman is furious, just outraged of all things. And with that in mind, after the ring is destroyed and they go back to the Shire, they find that all of what he saw in Galadriel's mirror, the scouring of the Shire is what it's called, which is basically, it is wiped out, all the green is destroyed, and it becomes like an urban wasteland where the hobbits are being tortured by a figure whose name is Sharky, and we know is Saruman. What does Frodo do in response to this figure who's been destroying his beloved Shire? When they capture him and everyone wants him to be killed, and Saruman expects it himself, by the way, Frodo does not give him what he deserves and what he desires, actually, which is to die, because he can die there on his own terms. He says this. Frodo says, "I will not have him slain. It is useless to meet revenge with revenge. It will heal nothing." And in response to this, Saruman tries to stab Frodo. But he learns from Gandalf there. He's not going to do an evil thing in response to an evil thing, or to judge in response to that. He's going to show him pity. And Saruman says this, or rather Frodo says this, because when he stabs him, then the hobbits want to kill Saruman in response to that, and Frodo intervenes and says, no, Sam, do not kill him even now, for he has not hurt me, and in any case I do not wish him to be slain in this evil mood. He was great once, of a noble kind that we should not dare to raise our hands against. He is fallen, and his cure is beyond us, but I would still spare him in the hope that he may find it. Shows him pity there at the end. It's not, and he's learned this from Gandalf. What's Saruman's response to it? He's so bitter. Because by receiving pity, he's removed his whole reason for being. Because he was wicked and bent on revenge, and now there's no reason for it anymore. It's just him. He shows that all the evil comes from him. It's not a just response. He's received pity from a figure that he's just tried to kill, and it's an unmerited favor, so he should show him pity in response and respond in kind. He is enraged by that. Now there's no justice in my own actions. I can't even justify myself in my own eyes. Right? So the response of a wicked figure to the act of pity, the possibility is that they will repent and say, oh, I didn't deserve that. And instead he hardens more and then comes at him again. But he says this, you have grown, halfling. You have grown very much. You are wise and cruel. You have robbed my revenge of sweetness, and now I must go hence in bitterness, in debt to your mercy. I hate it and you. So the grace that he has shown does not necessitate that he respond with gratitude. He ought to, but he has the choice of not doing so, and he does not do so. He hates it, bitter, and then he gets shot again with the arrows when he comes at him again, right? Against Frodo's wish. And interestingly, his blood goes into the ground, and there's this black mark there, and the effect of that, I think, lingers on long after that. The hobbits who are defending Frodo nonetheless kill him, and there's a consequence for the Shire as a consequence of that, which is not discussed there in the Lord of the Rings. But there is a sense that although it was just that they shot him there, the fact that they didn't show mercy shows that there's a bigger consequence to it. So again, the teaching of mercy is very strong there, and it continues right to the very end. And what happens is that mercy, or the pity that he shows, enables contrition. He should repent. He doesn't want to repent. He doesn't want to let go his selfish motives. He wants to feel like he's powerful. He's in charge. And he wants vengeance, and now he realizes that he has no reason for being avenged. And that just makes him even angrier. Because again, I'm not calling the shots here, and I'm a great being, and you're just a little hobbit, and you've grown, and you're a lot like Gandalf in this. Makes him absolutely furious. Yes?
In that way, does Tolkien give us clarity as to why Sauron was different than Gandalf?
Well, he chose to be like Sauron, because remember, he's just one of the Maya and just the chief of the order, and he chooses. Remember, Gandalf sees him, and it's Gandalf, it's Saruman the White, and he sees him, and he sees him manifest in a coat of many colors. And Gandalf comments that he preferred the white, and Saruman's response is that white is the entry point, but that the coat of many colors is the breaking of that into the many manifold possibilities. And Gandalf's comment is something that he who breaks a thing does an evil act and destroys something that's good. And it's never good to destroy something that's good. And he says, in which case it's no longer white as well. You've made it something else. That might be good, but you've broken what was good before. That's not, you can't do good things out of a bad act. And so there's a deep wisdom and awareness there. And he's making a comment on technology there, I think, as well. You can break something that's there. It reflects the creation of the fighting Uruk-hai and the orcs, for that matter, of creating beings with a sort of a purpose that distorts the thing that was good already. He's making a comment on eugenics as well, I think, and the use of technology in general. Yes, you will gain power over it, and you might develop something that's more potent. However, you have corrupted something that was already good, and no good can come from that. And he says, he who does such a thing departs from wisdom. And again, Saruman is furious at the charge, and eventually he takes his place in the order by dying and rising, becomes Gandalf the White. Lots of symbolism in all that. I don't know if that answers your question at all. I don't think it did. It went down a different path slightly, but
I guess what you're saying is that even that Gandalf and Saruman, they have a knowledge of.
they're sent into the world as they're wizards. They're there as stewards.
But they know they are.
They know they are, but he decides he doesn't want to be a steward. He wants to be a lord.
Right.
That's the problem. So they too have a choice, and Gandalf is presented with the same choice. He's given the ring. And he, interestingly, and their comment, he would use the ring out of pity. He would use it that way to heal the world, but that would not be the one thing that is needed, because he would show compassion or pity towards things that need to be ultimately destroyed. And that evil needs to be destroyed. It doesn't need compassion. It doesn't need healing, because that's just superficial. There's a depth to the evil that can't be simply understood or sympathized with. It needs to be eradicated wholly. It needs to be given up, the lust for power, even if it's used for good purposes. Galadriel faces the same or a similar choice and won't take the ring for that reason. But there, the motive would be pity. So he's rightly, he understands that pity is the right motivation. It's even his motivation, but you can't use the ring with pity in mind, because the ring is only evil. It's tied to this end, and it needs to be given up. You can't use evil means to do a good thing. Other questions or comments? And this is why I said when Aragorn in the film cuts off the head of the mouthpiece of Sauron, it's such a heinous act, and so out of touch with the main motive of pity for those who deserve judgment. Of course, this is a reprehensible, disgusting creature right in the face of you, and everyone's. I mean, he's well depicted in the movie. He's like, what a disgusting, horrendous being this is in front of you. But again, in striking him down, and not only doing that, but spinning around with his back turned on him so he's not expecting it. This is the opposite of knightly behavior, and it's certainly the opposite of pity. So it destroys the whole integrity of the motivation for Aragorn and all of the fellowship. I find it extraordinary that he put such a bad act in the hands of his main hero. And again, it's just like, well, these guys are on the good side and these guys are on the bad side, so as long as the good guys win, then good has won. As if the means were irrelevant to good and evil. So it's just these guys have shiny cloaks and these guys look disgusting and wear black cloaks. So like, that's the difference? Like, it's such a terrible theological understanding of what's going on there, or it's a non-theological understanding. It is a heretical understanding. It's good and evil are equal and opposite things, and here we have a good side, a bad side. The bad side's won, therefore there's only good here on in. Awful. Just dreadful. And then the scouring of the Shire, that's gone. So evil doesn't persist on. The portrait of Arwen in there, boss girl Arwen, okay, whatever, I don't care about that too much. But it's just the virtues of femininity are not promoted, and then the Rings of Power doubles down on it with boss girl Galadriel being toxic masculinity on stage. It's awful, dreadful. So there's no ability to read a text at all. Ask me what I really think. Other comments or questions about this? I do think that it's a keynote to see pity and love as the motive for the whole plot design. And it's interesting because, it doesn't present itself as a Christian work. But the motivations for the characters and the plot design are all that, I think. Or if it's not that, then what is it? I mean, what explains that? And again, the language is very clear. even down to pity being connected with piety, and why piety and why solidarity then with a being who seems to be your enemy, because your enemy is actually like you. That's why. So therefore love your enemies. There you go. That's how it cuts. It's terrific. Yes.
I guess as like kind of a closing question in terms of when the book closes and you look at Tolkien's desire to write a novel that speaks to England and his time.
Yep.
What do you think is the final comment being made there? Is it strictly to the universities? Is it?
No. No, I don't think so.
How do you think that he wants the reader to interpret it in that period?
I mean, he's obviously making a comment from the structure of the plot about how important the understanding of agape love is in the whole ordering of everything, including the university life. The light of Christ is the light that will shine in the universities. And without that light, there is no light. So that's clearly, it does apply to the universities, but he's talking about life in general.
Yeah.
That this is the governing, motivating principle for all areas of life. From family life, where I already cited the Shema in Deuteronomy 6, which Jesus says is the greatest commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength, which you're to teach to your children and write it on your, put it on your foreheads and on your wrists and on the pillars of your house and on the gates of the city. So love is the motivation for all this. It has a manifold and I think all-inclusive sense that will include knowledge as well, but also action. That's hence the hands. It's going to be marking all of these things, but again, it's marked by a sense that goes beyond justice then. There's a lot of talk of social justice in our day, justice in general, but grace is the motivation for true justice, because there's a recognition that at heart we are all sinners. And that's why Christ has to come and die. That's hence the importance of Good Friday. And I do think that pervades the novel, particularly if you then look at what happens to Aragorn after that as well, which if you just leave it with the return of the king, never mind the film version, which totally annihilates it, but even the book, you could get the sense that evil does not just carry on and probably get worse, because that is what Tolkien is saying. It does carry on. And Sauron, the evil of Sauron continues on. He will never again take a physical form. That much is clear, because it was bound up in the power of the ring. He will never be able to do that, but will he not endure in a more malevolent form? And I think his answer is yes. He only implies it. You have a spiritual danger, a threat there that you won't see in a physical form, but will be presented in a spiritual being perhaps that you can't see. Maybe a reference to Satan then. I don't know. That goes too far. He doesn't say anything of the sort, but a sense that the evil is not done with. It was vanquished once through an act of pity that allowed the grace and mercy of God to triumph over evil, and because of that, it will continue to be the case going forward as well. I think that's the main point that you would say in application to Tolkien's own day. The grace and mercy that marked the denouement of the plot here will also mark the world going forward. It's unimaginable within the context of the Lord of the Rings that it could be otherwise, and it's also, I think he means it to be unimaginable after that as well. This is the way the world works. And for that reason, it's not read in the universities. I think. That's my explanation. It's enormously popular. The people love it. they want it to be true, in a sense. Like, this is a great story. It's just fiction. But when fiction comments on life in the profound way that it does, then it seems pretty realistic. I think it's intended to be. Any other questions, comments? I think it's a good way to finish the course. Yeah, so if you've only ever watched the movie, you've robbed yourself of a great deal of the good of The Lord of the Rings. Don't watch the movie, read the books. You can always watch the movie, that's fine, but you'll then, it will upset you to see what happens in the movies, because it's not, it does seem like it's only a couple of scenes, but they're so decisive. And the motivations for the characters to do them are so bad. As I say, the way that Faramir is portrayed, I can't stand. And the way that Aragorn cuts off the head of Sauron's mouthpiece, I can't stand. Awful. The two wisest men do the most outrageous things. Well, in Aragorn's case, and Faramir, he's just a sniveling, crybaby. Awful. Daddy loved Boromir more. Okay, I'm done for today then. That's a good way to finish.